there. Now you have just opened up a 2.5 hour video. So if you're actually looking for a more condensed video on dog parks, I have done 2 separate videos that might be a better fit for you. The first one is a pro-con list of dog parks so that you can decide whether or not your dog is the right fit for dog parks. And the second video is discussing what behaviors, what stress behaviors you can expect once you're in the dog park. So if you're looking for a smaller version of this video, these 2 might be the right fit for you. Now, if you've checked out these 2 videos and maybe you're interested in doing a deeper dive and you really want to get nuanced and have a better understanding of how dog parks function, how dog ethology functions, then this video is the right one for you. What's up, guys? It's Jenna with Dog Liaison, where I coach you on how to enhance your dog's mental health. And on this channel, we break down scientific research in order to inform and educate us on how to train dogs. I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing Dr. Carolyn Walsh and Dr. Rita Anderson of the Canine Research Unit at Memorial University in Finland. And these 2 lovely ladies are leading experts in all things dog parks pertaining to dog behavior. They have an extensive body of research that they have done within the dog park for the last 15 years, and they were willing to go over all of that information with me, which is very fortunate. So because our interview went a little bit longer than I admittedly expected, I have given you some timestamps so that you can jump to relevant content that you're interested in. The timestamps are also in the description box below. Whether you decide to watch all 2.5 hours or just skip through to the main points, I really hope you enjoy this video, and I'll see y'all soon.
Alrighty, so we are here with Dr. Carolyn Walsh and Dr. Rita Anderson. And our friends here are from the Canine Research Unit at Memorial University in Canada, Newfoundland, Canada. And do you guys want to introduce yourselves to our audience really quick?
Sure. I'm Carolyn. So I'm an animal behavior researcher. My background originally is doing research on birds, but within the last 10 years or so, I've really started to become interested in canine science. And so we do a lot of dog research, domestic dog, pet dog research.
Okay, I'm Rita Anderson. I was originally a cognitive psychologist who got quite intrigued by animal behavior and have been searching for ways to approach the non-human mind in a legitimate fashion. One way or another, Carolyn and I got engaged in dog research, and it's been great fun.
And specifically as it pertains to dog research, you guys have spent a lot of time focusing on dog parks. And so that is going to be the focus of our discussion here, as focusing on behavior found in dog parks, how it's translated, and we are going to break down some of the studies that you guys have done. But I kind of want to set the tone for the discussion for our audience. And so, given the fact that so much of your research is based in dog parks, I'm wondering if you can tell us if you have a specific opinion on dog parks, the good, bad, otherwise, tell us about it.
Sure. So just to give you a little bit of background of why we started doing work in dog parks, we never really set out to study dog parks.
Oh, okay.
So I mentioned my background is actually seabird research and behavioral ecology in particular. And so when you do seabird research, often you spend a lot of time just observing, watching behavior. And so for my PhD, my doctorate, that's what I did. I sat on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic for hours and hours on end and watched individuals behave, right? And so we had a student a number of years ago, her name was Melissa House, who was really keen, actually. She really wanted to work with Rita to do some of the work that Rita had started on wolf social behavior. Rita can tell you a little bit maybe about that. But it was just not going to be possible for her to work on wolves. So Rita and I had sort of, joked around with each other before that, sort of saying like, oh, we should do a dog project some point. Wouldn't it be nice if we did some dog research? And when Melissa came along, we thought, well, maybe maybe she can do wolves. Maybe she wants to do domestic dogs. And so she did.
She leapt onto it.
She said, yes,
really
I would like to
into
do it. And so we looked at each other and said, okay, let's go for this. And given my background of sort of just observing animals in their natural environment, we thought, okay, well, what kind of project would we do for dog, social behavior or what? And
so let me jump in here. That I was associated with the Canadian Center for Wolf Research, and among other things, this was a hands-off, non-handled wolf pack that had lived and died and had pups and did all these things quite comfortably over 25 years, and we had videotape of their social interactions. And I spent a great deal of my time, and my students did, looking at interactions between wolves as they happen, which was very unusual to be able to do something like that at that time, because wolves don't like to hang out with people. But and we were never in there, but you could videotape from observation trailers. And so I had the background of observing, interacting canines.
Yeah.
And
I had the sort of the ethology, naturalistic observation background. So we kind of put that together and we thought, well, where could we actually just watch social behavior among dogs? And it turned out we thought, well, let's try the dog park, right? So, and we got, I guess, a bit naively thought that, dogs are going to be there and owners won't really interfere with their behavior. That's not exactly right, because anyone who goes to a dog park would know. Yeah. But by and large, they have the capacity, or they're given the ability to kind of freely interact with other dogs. So that was Mel's sort of, that's Mel. I always point to Mel House as being sort of the reason why we have the Canine Research Unit, or the crew as we call it. It was because she was actually interested in taking that on. So we started with dog parks, and then it's also a really nice project. We had a lot of undergraduate students involved in doing the dog park research, because it's a nice project for them to continue over the summer months if they're doing summer research assistant ships, and to go down and continue collecting data.
And I really want to add that at least at that dog park, the people that went there year after year were very, very into the research. And we would, in the spring of the year, start getting emails or whatever. Are you going to do it again next year?
Yeah,
what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Gee, we haven't seen you yet. They liked having their dogs be part of the research team. Now, we did nothing with the dogs except have a camera down there.
Yeah. And sometimes we asked, if they'd allow us to take saliva samples from their dogs so we could do hormonal assays or whatever. But they were mostly filling out questionnaires and letting us videotape.
And just being there.
Yeah. Doing what they do. And we were just
because
there
they're dog aficionados. Yeah.
So it occurred to us, so after we started that, wow, well, dog parks are a thing. And who else is doing research on dog parks? And there wasn't a whole lot at the time. I don't know. There was one study, I think, Melissa Cheyenne had done a study in Indianapolis, in one of the dog parks in Indiana, and that was published. And there was also some work from veterinarian Melissa Bain, who's at UC Davis, and that was mostly unpublished work, but it was available, sort of some conference presentations she had done. She had done some work in dog parks in Northern California, and then the
rest of it was on landscape design for dog parks.
So, and I think, there are some other studies now that have sort of joined this small body of literature around what, dogs do in dog parks. Alexander Horowitz has done some work on that. There's a few researchers in Italy, for example, who've looked at it, but still a small body of work.
So for all intents and purposes, you sort of just fell into the dog park setting, right? Did you go in with any sort of preconceived notions about the outcomes or the issues or non-issues of a dog park as far as, like, I guess, biases in general?
I don't think so. I mean, I certainly was coming at from, my dog's never gone to a dog park, but was a very social animal. And I had always been struck by the fact that when I looked at the literature, there was no literature on how well-adjusted dogs interact with their peers. And my experience was that they did a very good job. And so I was actually just curious to be able to document how do well-adjusted dogs interact with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think from my perspective, there wasn't any real bias. Again, I have had dogs all my life, and I kind of, my hobbies are around dog sports. So I'm involved with that, but I hadn't ever really used dog parks for my own dogs. But once we started looking around to see what was out there, what was written about dog parks in the literature, and again, in the scientific literature at that time, there wasn't a whole lot. And there was some stuff that was coming out of what I'll call the training literature, like, some of the training books. And most of it seemed to have a negative bias around using dog parks. Not all of it, but, there was some suggestions that, dog parks were places where you might expect to see dogs fighting or aggression, or, they were potentially damaging to anything that you were trying to train, any behaviors you were trying to train in your dog, or that they were stressful for dogs. And so that was sort of some of the later work that we did around hormones, was to start to evaluate, okay, well, what happens in the dog park with hormones? Like, is there evidence that dog parks maybe are stressful for some dogs? And so, yeah, so that's sort of, we became aware of some of this, I would say, controversy, I guess, around the use of dog parks back then, but
I think
it hasn't gone away, it turns out.
I think it's also fair to say that when we started, there was only one dog park in the city.
Yeah.
There was there were several huge forested areas that were off leash, but not a formal dog park.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's only over the past, since we've been
10
doing
years
this,
or
that the number of dog parks has increased.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of, I like that training literature phrase. That's a good one. I'm going to steal that. Because in a lot of the training literature, there is a lot of biases. And I think that since you guys went into a very very objectively and very open-minded, that's sort of how I want to carry this. I think it's worth saying for our viewers that I too am pretty open-minded about it. I think it has pros and cons, and so that's really how I want to approach it. And it's more about just looking at on the whole and then applying it directly to individuals. It's not about saying, like this dog or this amount of dogs and this quality of dog and this breed of dog is going to be good and this quality or breed of dog is going to be bad to the dog park. It's about looking at it on the individual. And so I think that's one of the reasons I was so intrigued by your studies, is that you guys didn't actually look at specific breeds and their behavior as they pertain to the breed, right? I mean, I don't think that is a bad study. I just think that this was needed to be happened first. I think that on the whole, this probably was a little bit better, because I think that if we had just jumped right into the gun and said, well, if these particular types of breeds or these particular types of dogs do this behavior, that would have set off a bad ripple, I think. And it's almost better that we didn't look at that and we looked at it as more of just the dog, right?
So part of the reason, though, why we haven't done more breed analysis is really that we're not inviting people to come to the dog park. We're just taking advantage of whoever shows up while we're there.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, there are some, like we had some common breeds that are probably reflecting the dog breeds that are common here in this geographic region. So like there were quite a few Huskies and quite a few Beagles, lots of Labrador Retrievers, which is probably common everywhere in the world. But, specific breeds, it was really hard to even try to conceive of doing an analysis at that level, just because we wouldn't have sufficient numbers of each breed to be able to say something that was really valid. Yeah.
And that still continues to be true.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys have basically 3 different papers, or 3 different, I guess, entities. And so within each of those, you guys study a variety of things. So I have sort of separated them kind of by their paper, just to kind of organize it. but I know that some of them are going to crisscross a little bit. Yeah. But I want to start off with the first paper that you guys published in 2013. And you guys in that paper had two different studies. We're going to talk about the first study first because I know it's minimal, and then we're going to separate into the second. Yeah. So the first study tested cortisol levels, and you guys compared basically the cortisol levels of a dog just on a 20-minute walk, and you tested that, and then you tested the cortisol levels of a dog in the dog park, right? So this particular question is very a dog trainer question, okay? When I was reading it and I saw dog walk, I immediately thought, okay, wait a minute, what kind of dog walk, right? And the first question I had was, you know, first of all, what type of walk was it? And second, does it even matter, right? Would it make a difference in the cortisol levels if they were doing a different type of walk? And by different types or style, I mean, you know, if you've got a dog that stops at every single bush and sniffs versus a dog that's in maybe a more formal heel walk versus a dog that's at the end of the leash pulling and is just trying to get to destination. So my question for you is, A, did you guys track what the type of walk was? And B, do you think it would even matter?
Right. So I just want to say, so this was our first published study on the dog walk or on the dog park, but it was one of our second study that we actually started to do. It's just that the first study was published later.
Okay.
So this is the dog walk and dog park cortisol comparisons were actually one of my undergraduate honors students. Her name is Amanda Steer, who did this as part of her honors thesis in the psychology department here. And so we just had people who took their dogs to dog parks and were willing to visit the dog park when we were going to be there to help collect saliva samples, and we're also willing to collect saliva samples before and after just a walk. So you raised a really good question. It's a good trainer type question. And the answer is we don't know because we didn't collect those data. So I don't know what kind of walk they actually, all we instructed them or all we asked them to do is like on your regular walk, you know, have it last about 20 minutes. You know, if you usually walk longer, like cut it short, or if you don't walk that long, maybe you can extend it a few minutes or whatever. So because we wanted to keep the time frame consistent for the comparison between the walk and the dog park. So we just asked them just to go for their regular neighborhood walk. So yeah, you're right. There could have been differences. Like some of those dogs might have met other dogs. Some of them might not have. But it turns out that there really wasn't that much change in the cortisol levels over that 20-minute walk. In fact, there was no change at all, pretty much.
You could detect.
Yeah, that we could detect. So it didn't seem that, and again, because I think these dogs were used to being walked in that neighborhood, it wasn't a novel place. It wasn't a novel event for them to go out under a leash and have a walk. You know, no big deal.
Their daily walk.
It was a daily thing, and there was no reflection in terms of change of cortisol for that. But
So,
for those,
go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, I was going to say, for those.
Okay, guys, for the dog park version.
For the same dogs that went to the dog park, though, we did see a significant increase in cortisol levels for those same dogs. And so this was the same dogs compared under both circumstances. So we call that a within subject comparison. And it did significantly increase. And, you know, so that was the first time that we had, I think the first time that it had been shown that that actually cortisol can change after just a 20-minute interaction in the dog park. And of course, keep in mind that, you know, we asked the owners to take the saliva sample just before they left the house. So, you know, it was 20 minutes in the dog park, but they probably also, you know, drove a little bit.
Yeah,
like that.
right.
Yeah.
And so I was remiss. I would like you to briefly try to describe cortisol and how it's tested and its significance, and why did we test cortisol instead of something else?
Yeah. So cortisol is, most of us think of cortisol as a stress hormone, right? So that's typically what we think of cortisol as, generally speaking. And we have cortisol. Humans have cortisol. Dogs have cortisol. Other animals have cortisol. Some have another form called corticosterone. Anyways, it's a glucocorticoid hormone that gets released from our adrenal glands, or dogs' adrenal glands, in response to a stressor. And usually when we think about stress, like our human perception of stress is often like, oh, it's a bad thing, like it's negative stress, right? And that's not, from a sort of a completely physiological perspective, that's not what necessarily stress is. So a stressor is just any kind of event or challenge in animals and individuals' environment. That could be the external environment, or in fact the internal physiological environment, that needs to be met. So there's a challenge that needs to be met, and there are certain mechanisms in the body that prepare an organism to meet those challenges in a physiological way. So cortisol, which gets released from the adrenals, and there's a whole process, we call it the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, HPA axis, that ultimately ends up with our adrenals, with the dog's adrenals, releasing cortisol. And there are other stress sort of related systems that we can tap into as well to try to see, okay, well, they're also trying to prepare the organism to meet this challenge in the environment. But cortisol is, I guess, at the time we used it because it's a common hormone that was easily measured in saliva. So we were able to get the assays were well developed, so it was easy to do cortisol assays. And while it's easy to get the values for cortisol, it's the interpretation of what cortisol means that is sometimes more challenging. So the hormonal part, the extraction, the getting the value, the cortisol values are pretty easy. It's the interpretation that might be a little bit more challenging. Yeah.
So I just want to throw in, I am not the hormone person, and I hear this and I keep saying, yeah, I have a dog that when a social event happens, he gets really excited, etc. His mane goes up and he just jumps in. He's really aroused.
Yeah.
He has high cortisol, but it's good cortisol.
Right.
And,
Right.
and it's on the interpretation.
Yeah.
Right.
I think Carolyn did this wonderful thing that I'm going to steal from her, which, you're at the fairgrounds and you can go on a roller coaster ride and you're on there. That's very arousing. I bet if we measured cortisol levels, it would be high.
Yeah.
But would it be bad?
Right.
No, that's why I go on the ride.
Yeah.
So, and then of course I could be in a really bad situation and scared out of my wits and highly aroused. That would be bad.
Yeah.
But arousal and then the interpretation.
Right. Right. So,
and it's sad that the terminology has been stressor all along.
Yeah.
Because that, of course,
we've co-opted the term really to
it denotes bad,
but
that's not
what it means.
the intention.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, what we've just described is what we'd call an acute response, or an acute cortisol response, where you're immediately responding, your system is responding to something in the environment. There's also chronic stressors. Sometimes we talk about chronic stressors, and those are sort of long-term situations very often, where you'd see sort of long-term changes in the regulation of cortisol. And there's been some work, we haven't really done that work in our lab, but there's some recent work that's come out looking at signals of chronic stressors or long-term cortisol in hair. So you can actually get those measures from fur. So you can take fur samples and look at that. And so, but they're different processes and not unrelated, but sometimes we don't always make that clear, that what we're describing in these dog park papers is really an acute response to an immediate kind of situation.
Sorry, if you ever see me looking down, I'm writing. That's what I'm doing.
It's okay.
So moving on into the second part of this first 2013, which turns out wasn't really the first one. You guys were testing a personality test, which we're going to talk about in a second for reviewers. You guys were testing personality tests based off of personality traits and how they correspond with cortisol. And then you also tested how that cortisol would correspond with certain behaviors. So first of all, the personality test that you guys use, we're going to call MCPQ-R. But do you want to tell us about that and educate the audience in briefly?
Sure.
Do you have a
We actually gave a talk this last week we're involved in a research exchange group, and so we talked a little bit about that, but I don't know if I can share the slide. I was hoping I could figure out how to share the slide with you, but I'll talk a little bit about it then, and then we'll see. Maybe I can send you the slide if you want to sort of put it in. So the MCPQ-R stands for the Monash Canine Personality Questionnaire Revised. And Monash is named after Monash University in Australia. And Jackie Lay, who's a veterinarian, she worked on this for some of her research, her thesis work, in Pauline Bennett's lab. With some other research as well. There's other co-authors. But they developed this personality assessment tool, and then made sure that it was valid and reliable. So one of the challenges sometimes is, like, we all know we can go on the internet and find personality tests or quizzes, right, you know, for ourselves and for our dogs and cats and whatever. But what we're using is actually what we would call a psychometric valid and reliable tool. So it's gone through processes, for example, of testing and retesting. So over a period of, I can't remember how many months, probably 6 months or whatever, you know, do you get the same answers if you go back to the owners and ask them to rate their dog's personality 6 months later, right? So that would be test, retest.
And the sample size
yes.
initially is
very
quite large. It's
sample.
not just 5 dogs. It's hundreds.
Yeah. And so we were looking at the time, you know, in the literature for this kind of dog personality. And since that time, there's others as well. So there are other psychometrically valid and reliable dog personality assessments out there. What we like about the MCPQ-R, especially for like in a dog park setting, is that it really is just a list of 26 adjectives that would describe a dog, and the owners only have to rate it on a scale of 1 to 7, I believe it is, or 1 to 6, I'm not sure, I can't remember. But anyways, on a sliding scale, how much does this describe your dog? So it's really easy, and like you know, a dog park is sort of sometimes a little bit chaotic setting, and so it's easy for owners to fill that test out.
And the adjectives are the types of things that I, as a dog owner, don't need to be trained. Active. I'm trying to think of friendly, you know, things like that you probably, if you don't know about your dog, I'd be really surprised.
Yeah.
And it's not a deep psychoanalytic approach to the dog. It's just describe how your dog behaves.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And in the development then of this test, what they found is that these adjectives can be grouped into 5 personality dimensions. So they use personality dimensions. Sometimes we call it traits, personality traits,
or constructs.
So there's 5 sort of constructs that this test will describe a dog on, and we usually just, you know, give them percentages, right? So it's not like we're trying to put dogs in boxes that they're like, you know, extroverted or they're aggressive.
Your dog will have a profile.
Yeah. So it's a very
some level of extroversion, some level of amiability, some level of motivation.
Yeah. And so dog owners often ask us if we'll provide them with the results of the MCPQ-R for their dog, and we can tell them what their percentages are, but that's not necessarily very meaningful. So this is really meaningful as a research tool because we actually, you know, are able then to evaluate dogs sort of at a population level or group level, like, you know, to look at what relationships might be amongst certain, you know, ranges of personality, where dogs are on that personality dimension, and maybe behaviors, for example, right? So
Carolyn keeps mentioning validity as well. Among other things, you've got the assessment on the MCPQ. Does a dog that gets a high activity rating, is it a high activity dog? Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's been validated against real behavior.
And so there's multiple studies now, including the study that we are talking about right now, which was actually another honor student at the time was Lydia Ottenheimer Carrier. So this is the study that we've been talking about that she did for her honors in the dog park. So she was one of the first studies to actually show that, actually if dogs are rated as high in the dimension that the MCPQ-R calls extroversion, which for For the dog
dog,
version of
it's-
extroversion is just an activity measure. It's
Yeah.
not like when we think of an extroverted person, we think of someone who's really outgoing. It kind of captures that, but it's really about activity level. So it turns out that most dogs in the dog park, their owners actually do rate them as fairly high on the extroversion scale, maybe a little higher than maybe the average pet dog would be rated. And maybe that's not surprising, right? Because if you probably have an active dog at home, you might be looking for outlets for their energy, right? So, I mean, maybe you're more likely to bring them to a dog park. So, yeah. But we do know also that, Lydia's study showed that in the dog park that some of these dimensions, MCPQ-R dimensions, do correlate with behavior. So, for example, if the dogs are rated relatively high on the dimension called sociability, right? So, which is friendliness, essentially, then they actually show more play interactions. So they have a higher frequency of interacting with other dogs. So.
Well, and that's a good segue into what you guys were finding. And so you guys you guys correlated basically 3 different things, but we're going to start off with how the personality test related to behavior specifically. Okay, so this is kind of putting cortisol on the hold for a second. Okay. So I'm going to quote you guys, and just for the audience, I'm also going to put the captions on the bottom so that they can kind of track along too. Because sometimes, just as a heads up to our audience, is that I had to read a couple of these sentences multiple times just to really click. Right? So I recommend that my audience do the same. Please push pause. Please read this. Please let it really sink in, because I think much of what I've decided to extract is very important. Okay, so you wrote dogs who displayed more agonistic behaviors tended to exhibit more stress-related behaviors, and the total number of stress-related behaviors shown was correlated significantly with frequency of hunched posture. Now we're going to talk about the hunched posture in a second, because that is a significant moment. And you also wrote that 78% of the sample displayed at least one stress signal. So what I would like you to do is help us distinguish between agonistic behaviors and stress-related behaviors, because that sometimes gets muddy, right?
Yeah. Okay, well, one of the things that we haven't talked about, I wish I had brought a copy of the paper with me, but the behaviors that were coded were taken from prior research that we had some belief that were well validated. Agonistic snapping at something would have been associated with more aggressive behavior. And so the collection of behaviors that we code, or Lydia coded, not we, have already been published.
Yeah. And I think the same for the stress-related behaviors. These were behaviors that we took from the literature, either the academic, what I'll call the academic literature, and or the training literature, actually, where we thought, well, we might expect to see these as indicators of stress if some dogs are in fact stressed in the dog park. So we had, specific types of behaviors that we were looking for. And I just want to say that, one of the big things that and we might get to this when we talk about the second paper, that was actually the first study, just to confuse everybody. But we really do like this idea of not assigning motivation to a behavior before
it's been demonstrated.
Before you can demonstrate that it is related to that motivation. So in a way, like, we kind of, got around that a little bit by saying that, well, these are the types of behaviors that people, I would say, not people don't necessarily frame it this way, I'm framing it this way, but we hypothesize that these behaviors are related to a stress response, right? And so those are the types of what we call stress-related behaviors. And the agonistic behaviors, again, as Rita said, they were, what we would expect to be more defensive or aggressive behaviors, where a dog was trying to maybe avoid a social interaction potentially,
growl, stay away,
or aggress, to another individual. So
And so the fact that you got basically that 70% of the sample ended up showing at least one stress-related behavior that's not too surprising then, since the stress-related behaviors are a much broader list and more encompassing than a more
Over a
agonistic.
20-minute period.
Yeah.
So I say that again?
It's over a 20-minute period. You know,
That too, yeah.
the dog
Yeah.
presenting at least one of up to, I think there were like 10 different behaviors that were
Yeah, I
coded.
don't have the table,
Yeah.
but yeah. And I think again, we're talking about these as stress-related behaviors, and again, as we're hypothesizing that they're what we believe might be an indicator of a dog that's being stressed. It's not necessarily always the case. For example, now I don't think we coded this in the DS paper, but for example, we talk a lot, especially in training circles, around like sniffing the ground, like a dog is sort of like sniffing, is turning it off. That wasn't one of the behaviors. No. But so sniffing the ground, sometimes it's just sniffing the ground. So sometimes it can be indicator of the dog having a stress response, but that's not necessarily always the case.
Especially at a dog park where there's been a lot of activity and you want to know who's been around.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what was interesting that some of the stress signals or potentially stress-related behaviors that we might have expected to see, like sort of minor ones like paw lifts or lip licking, which again we know can be an indicator of stress. We didn't see that very often in most dogs. So in that dog park context, you don't necessarily see the full range of stress-related behaviors that you might see in another context. For example, in the vet's office, I bet you would, and there's some literature that shows us that you would see more lip licking or, nose licking. Yeah.
Okay. And so one significant behavior, one significant posture even that was really a topic of really coverage in your papers was this hunched posture. So we're gonna break down this hunched posture because it's, I would say, arguably in my opinion, the most important part. I know that's arguable, but in my opinion, I think the hunched posture was the most enlightening. And so briefly, if for the person who has no idea what hunched posture would look like, and if you don't mind, I think I'll impose a picture here later on too, so that people have a visual. But can you describe what's considered a hunched posture for you?
Yeah. So we do have a table in our paper, and we can make the paper available to your listeners or to your viewers if you want. So we could actually, we have an author's copy that we can use. And it would list the exact definition that we use, but in a general way, without being too technical. So it's, the dog actually starts showing often a curvature of the back. So there's like a lowering of the front body and the back body. So you kind of see this sort of hunching. And often the posture is also lower to the ground. So they're kind of like shrinking themselves a little bit, often making themselves lower to the ground.
And the tail curves around in that.
Yeah. We separated the tuck tail and the hunch posture, but they really are correlated. So we score them separately, but it turns out that very often the tuck tail accompanies a hunch posture, which we know, right? So yeah. So that's what it looks like.
And so the hunch posture was correlated with the tucked tail and the runaway behaviors as well. So is it reasonable that if a person who had no idea what a hunch posture was, they could look at a dog who looks like that curve and have that tucked tail and probably was trying to run away? Is it reasonable for them to assume then that if they see that probably speaking, there's a higher cortisol level?
So the individuals maybe this is, I have to qualify that. So there's not one-to-one mapping, right? Yeah. And so we could have a dog that never shows hunch posture, but has higher cortisol, and he's just like, or she, they're like just completely active and like running around, like they're thrilled, right? So they're totally aroused, and that may be what the cortisol level is reflecting. However, we did see a relationship, as you said, so you took that from the paper, and you're absolutely right, that there was among the dogs with that hunch posture, that displayed hunch posture, and there wasn't a huge number of them, which is a good thing from a welfare perspective. I think that people belong there. They probably shouldn't be there, but those dogs had some of the highest cortisol levels that we saw, that we were able to detect. So in that case, the behavior plus the elevated cortisol really suggests they're kind of corroborating each other to suggest that we can probably be pretty certain that that dog is not having a positive emotional experience in the park, right? The body language is indicating stress, like in terms of it being a negatively interpreted sort of stressor for that dog. Because in fact, we know hunched posture and tucked tail probably indicates fear. So it's probably a fear, and running away, right? Those are all indicators of sort of a fear response. And when we see the elevated cortisol, we can probably be pretty certain that that cortisol is reflecting not only other things that might be going on, like which I think elevated cortisol can reflect in other dogs, but it's probably mostly reflecting a fearful response.
Yeah, and I'm glad that was exactly what I was trying to get you to say. Because I wanted to qualify that, because I think that when people see this and they go, okay, the hunched posture significantly correlates with higher cortisol, therefore I see a dog with a hunched posture, higher cortisol, right? And I think that it's like, well, maybe, right? We have to, there's a lot of other variables. We can't just be jumping the gun too much. And so that was exactly what I was trying to extract from you. And I think particularly in the trainer community, that would have been a leap that some trainers would have made.
Sure.
And so I wanted to put that within a little bit more context. So one of the things that you I'm over, I guess, not really simplifying, but over paraphrasing what I'm about to say, but you guys basically correlated the hunched posture with neuroticism and hunched posture with higher cortisol, but neuroticism did not necessarily correlate with cortisol. So a couple of things on that. First of all, describe what neuroticism is considered.
Okay, so in the MCPQ-R, neuroticism is one of the 5 personality dimensions, and it basically consists of the adjectives. I can't remember all of them now, but I think there's 4 adjectives: fearful, timid, afraid, I think is one of them, and I'm forgetting the last one. But it's really around neuroticism is around sort of the spookiness,
discomfort,
the fearfulness of the dog, right? So
with the situation.
Yeah. So low neuroticism would mean, the dog tends to be pretty nonchalant about stuff, not usually showing any kind of fearful reactions, whereas a dog that would be ranked sort of as high on that scale would be like, sort of a typical fearful dog. Yeah. So it is really interesting, and we were surprised by that result, in fact, that we didn't see a relationship between neuroticism and cortisol across all dogs in the study. And I think that's a really good indicator of the fact that cortisol is kind of a messy hormone, right? So I describe cortisol, and as you asked me to describe what it is, it readies your system, a dog's, to
rise to the occasion.
Yeah, to sort of cope with whatever's happening in the environment. And there's a lot of things happening in the environment and a dog park, obviously. One of the interesting relationships that Lydia also found was that the cortisol levels actually correlated with the frequency of dog park visits in a negative way. So that the more often a dog was in the dog park, the lower the cortisol level was on average. So there was that relationship, right? So if the dog was new to the dog park, then they tended to have higher cortisol levels. So what does it mean, new to the dog park? Well, it's a novel physical environment for dogs, full of all kinds of smells and everything else.
And you probably don't know anybody.
It's a novel social environment, right? So you don't know other dogs that are there if you don't go to the dog park very often, probably. Or you don't know the humans. And so there's a lot of novelty that I think can actually enhance or increase that cortisol response, right? So we do know that cortisol does rise in relation to novelty. So I think that's part of why we didn't see that relationship. It turns out in a later study, and we actually haven't published this, but we do have data and I've presented it at a conference, that when we have dogs, when we kind of remove that relationship or the novelty of the dog park, and we have dogs that are in a dog park, they're used to going to that dog park, they're interacting with other familiar dogs, not dogs they live with or anything like that, but dogs that they see in that environment. And, they're kind of, we call them the dog park regulars, right? They go down there. When we look at their cortisol levels, in fact, we see an emergence of this relationship between neuroticism and cortisol. So those dogs, so what's happening, I think, in that case is that we're taking out something that's also going to impact cortisol. We take out all that novelty. There's no novelty, right? They know the other dogs, they know the dog park, so their cortisol response is not going to be to novelty, right? Or to a novel social environment. And so it kind of lets that potential relationship that we'd all expect to see, right? Between neuroticism or fearfulness in the dog and cortisol, it lets that relationship emerge. So I think of, cortisol is like a blunt instrument, right? It's messy, it can tell us, it can give us information, but by and large, on its own, it's not terribly useful, right? So
I think one of the things to keep in mind is that it's not just the dog, it's not just the hormone, it's not just the situation, but it's that interaction of everything. And as we all know, our bodily systems are quite complex, so are our environments and our social milieu. And so finding a direct one-to-one relationship is somewhat unlikely, unless it's something that is clearly arousal versus not. That kind of makes sense. Novelty, we can assess that, and that's pretty big. My personal way of interacting with the world, well, that's being buffeted by a whole lot of factors that need to be controlled in order to see how it's working.
Right. And the novelty, I have actually a couple of questions coming up on that novelty idea. We'll get to those in a second, but I hadn't even thought of that playing a role in sort of, when I saw that neuroticism wasn't correlating with higher cortisol, but all of these other variables were, I was like, I couldn't make sense of that.
I know.
No straight lines here.
Yeah, exactly.
And we couldn't make sense of it until we did that second study, right? And actually, or like a third or fourth, whatever it was. But we actually were able to start pulling out. It was like, oh, okay, well, that makes some sense. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so regarding the hunched posture specifically, since we know that at least as representative in your study, it's representative of a higher cortisol level, it's representative of more stress, probably more fear, right? There is a conception, though, that this hunched posture would be actually appropriate, socially appropriate, because the dog is submitting to another dog, and that this is a way of sort of making more comfort and being polite. Was that something that you guys found to be true, or walk me through that?
I wouldn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole.
So I will.
I don't think. I do think that dogs are pretty socially adept. That they're pretty wise. That they do have minds, and I can't imagine that there are very many dogs that go into a social situation, whether of their choice or not, and say, "Oh, best thing I can do is to be submissive." It doesn't wash, and we do have some interesting evidence that quite counters that interpretation. But it's video evidence, not numeric evidence.
Right. So I think, I mean, I understand, I completely understand your question and where it's coming from. And I guess what kind of my perspective on some of this is that I'm not convinced, based on the literature, and this goes beyond just the dog park literature, obviously, that that the hunched posture is necessarily any kind of sign of submission to another dog, right? And I think there's a few papers that come out of some sort of, kind of artificial settings, like laboratory settings, that are sort of making that argument. But not everyone is accepting. So that's a big controversy. That's probably even more controversial than the dog park. Should I go to the dog park? This is another talk.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Have another session on this. But so there's that little bit, and I think it is possible. So I would be willing to sort of suggest that, it's possible that, if a dog is fearful and shows this particular, what we might think of as a signal, even though, we got to be, as researchers, we want to be really careful how we use that word, but I'm okay with using that. It's a postural response that other dogs would look at that and say, okay, he's telling me to leave him alone, right? So that might be useful. In fact, it could facilitate, because most of the dogs that are fearful probably want to be left alone, right? So in fact, that may help. We haven't done that analysis on the video data to say that, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's actually the case, at least for dogs that are kind of like socially adept, right? Dogs that are like, have those social skills. They see another dog with hunched posture, that's probably, I probably will, leave them alone. So, and not necessarily all dogs would do that, but yeah, I can't. So if the question is around, like, can that behavior facilitate the dog's experience in the park in terms of getting the other dogs to leave them alone? Yes, it probably could, if the other dogs have that social contract, if you want, if they're aware of, this is a sort of what I will do, I will leave that dog alone. But we don't have those data. But it is the intentionality around what kinds of behaviors dogs, or what the intentionality is when we see a dog engaging in a behavior. It's not clear that we have much information around that. And in fact, the hunched posture may just be this stress reaction, if you want, this fear reaction, that there's it's not necessarily, we don't have to ascribe intention that the dog is doing this to get other dogs to leave him alone. That's what's happening. It may have the effect of getting other dogs to leave him alone, and so that might work, and maybe there is intention, but that's also a really hard thing to study.
We aren't there yet.
Yeah, we're not there yet. Yeah.
And
nobody's there yet, I think, not just us, but yeah.
So it came and went through my head, but what Carolyn's basically saying is that we do not actually have the data.
Yeah.
We have very rich interpretation out there of a particular form of behavior, but we do not have the empirical evidence about how other dogs are responding to that postural information, or how that dog then is subsequently responding. And we need it. We desperately need it to be able to make sense out of whether that dog is trying to communicate something and what they're trying to communicate.
Thank you. That was better said than I said.
Oh, I listened to you and I translate. Right.
Well, we'll just cut out that snippet and put it on a t-shirt, and that's it.
But no, I mean, that's one of the things that we keep finding. We really, really have need of clear descriptions of behavior in context, and what the initiator does, what the recipient does, etc., to begin to even understand clearly what may be going on.
What the motivation might be.
Because we as humans are incredibly adept at making up stories. About what we think is going on without any evidence whatsoever.
And we inherit that, right? So there is a legacy that some people have actually written about and traced, this whole idea around dominance and submissive behaviors and whatever. And we can look back to, we know where that has come from. And often it, however, it's like the telephone game, right? You pass it on or whatever, and then the message kind of does get distorted.
And it's hard to stop it.
It's
hard to correct it.
So there are a lot of beliefs around intentionality or motivation for particular dog behaviors that I think the way I always like to describe it is okay, well, those are hypotheses about why a dog is doing something. Now you need data. let's go and collect data, and let's be able to evaluate the data in an objective way. And does that behavior actually indicate something about whatever you think it is? So one of the good examples, and I know you, this is not our work, but it's some work that we really like, is behavior on rollovers, right? So this was some work done in University of Lethbridge a few years ago, in Serge Pellis's lab, and Louise Barrett was involved. And I'm forgetting the first author's name, but she was one of the students that was working on it. And so the rollover is sort of the dog lies flat on his back, what we would often call full submission, right? So in the training literature and in the scientific literature around wolf behavior, that would have been described as sort of full submission. Yeah, so you're completely exposed and vulnerable, right? And then, so what they actually did was to get dogs to come into the lab and play in diet, so 2 dogs at a time, and video record them. And they had hypotheses around what does that posture actually indicate, and various hypotheses. So submission was one of them, right? That this was a submissive posture, and then they had others. And again, these are not aggression situations. These are 2 well-adjusted dogs that like to play with other dogs, and they were playing nicely with each other. And so their data, and again, I can send you the link for the paper, suggests that nope, in this context, that rollover behavior has nothing at all to do with submission. There's no data, none of their data support that. And in fact, it supports some of the other hypotheses. So we've kind of have been doing readjustments, and that's how science works though. So I know sometimes it's frustrating for people who want to, like, I just want the answer. Tell me what it is, right? And so the scientific process, is about evaluating and then reevaluating, and then having other, labs replicate work, or, sort of switch up things a little bit, and, see, does everything hold up, right? And so sometimes people, I think, do get frustrated and feel like the story changes, and it does sometimes change because knowledge changes, right? We learn things and we add to our knowledge base, and sometimes we have to update. And sometimes when you're updating that, you have to chuck out what you thought you knew already, right? And so that's sort of the process. And I think, what's exciting for me, since we've started this, 12 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, we've seen such change. Things have really changed. So this knowledge base is getting updated. And so some work too that Sarah Boisier has done on play vows and the function of play vows. We're updating our thinking around play vows, for example. So anyways, there's lots of exciting things going on in terms of the knowledge base around dog behavior is expanding, and actually expanding pretty rapidly over the last 15 years or so. So I think it's good, but I think sometimes it takes us a while to catch up, and it takes a while for us, like sort of the researchers who are doing it, to kind of translate it into something meaningful, which is why we're sitting here with you, because you're actually helping us through that translation. And so we really need people like you who have an interest in the research world, and are fundamentally in the training world, if you want, and you're able to try to do that translation for people. So that's really fantastic. Yeah.
I have to say, what was very interesting about that whole answer from both of you was that I asked you a pretty yes or no answer, and you managed to not answer that way. And I have to say that is a testament to really how it should be, because I think that when a lot of times just on either side, people want to completely denounce the behavior of this is not submission, this is not healthy, this is not, they want to automatically say no, 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 and then you have the alternative, which is yes, yes, yes. And it's like, you guys are basically saying, you can't answer that with a yes or no, and I think that more people need to be answering that way. And so, first of all, thank you for answering that way, because that's how it should be said. But secondly, you said a very interesting word, Dr. Anderson. You said story. And what was funny to me about that was that I often try to think, are we just creating these behaviors and putting them in narratives? Or are we seeing these behaviors and they're actually happening the way we're interpreting them, right? And so within your guys' paper, you found that really high cortisol, or the stress hormone, really only correlated with the Hunched posture. And in fact, it did not significantly correlate with any other position, the lip lick, the yawn, the whatever, right? And so as a trainer, and I think even as a dog owner, that's frustrating because it's like, okay, well then does that mean that all these behaviors that we've been told for years are not stressful? Are we told that these behaviors are no longer stressed? So I guess the question would be that it's like, which do we believe, or has more validity? Do we pay attention to these behaviors and kind of try to give function even though we can't really because the data is not there? Or do we just only look at cortisol because that's, truthful, right? Go for it.
Data.
Yeah.
We need, I mean, for almost all of the stress behaviors that were coded, as I recall, like lip licking, and Carolyn mentioned sniffing ground, which we didn't. We actually need to know how frequently those occur in what context.
Yeah.
We don't know. We know that people have said, oh, this is a stress behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I didn't know that a particular stress behavior was considered as a stress behavior. And I went home and I watched my dog do it in many different contexts and said, are you stressed? Are you stressed?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you are.
Yeah.
So I don't know about that one. I'm not even going to name it, but we need data.
Yeah.
We desperately need data, and data that is not categorized a priori as one thing or another. We did code use agonistic behaviors and stress behaviors, but that was provisional.
Yeah.
Because we could get them, other people had used them.
Yeah.
Maybe they would be good indicators, maybe not. We didn't find any relationships.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean they don't exist, but it also doesn't mean that they're good.
Yeah. And so there's a couple of things I think that I wanted to say. So again, context is so critical, right? And I think some of the things, because we want to sometimes have like a real simple reductionistic kind of answer, like we don't stress enough the importance of context. So context is critical. The fact that we don't see particular behaviors that in other contexts, in a dog park, that in other contexts might be considered stress signals is interesting, right?
In the vet office, it might be very different.
Yeah. So I think that's an important factor. The other thing is individual differences among dogs, right? So there's no question that just like any other, creature, humans or otherwise, you're going to have differences in terms of the types of behaviors that are going to be indicators for that dog, right? And so I think that is something we haven't actually really studied all that well yet. No one has, but there's no question that what I would suggest sort of in a practical way is that, owners need to kind of become aware of what behaviors are indicators of stress in their dog. It might not be the same as in my dog, right? So some of them, there's going to be some similarities, of course, right? And I would suggest that hunched posture is probably a really common one, that if you see that, that's really is a indicator of pretty, fearful reaction. So that's kind of getting to the end of the spectrum where, most dogs would show that behavior if they were fearful. But yeah, there's that range of behaviors and the different types of behaviors that different dogs would show. And I think owners can become kind of experts in their own dogs to see. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing is that I don't want people to get the impression that behavioral observation is subjective, right? And I think, it can be, but when we try to do research, animal behavior research, we take as many precautions as you want to make sure that it's not subjective, right? That is, it is as objective as any other measure, like taking a hormone measurement, right? And there are different things that we can do to make sure that the behavior is objective. One of them is around the definition, right? So we take lots of painstaking effort, right, to create these definitions that any observer should be able to look at that definition, that behavior, and then see if that dog is exhibiting that behavior, right? And you wouldn't need necessarily a lot of special training to do that. So that's one of them.
And when we're using that definition and coding, we have another coder use the same definition, look at the same behaviors, and find out whether they are making the same decision as the original coder. To assess reliability, and have we described something clear enough that other people, two people can see the same thing.
So good behavioral research always involves that inter-rater reliability, where we don't publish the paper and say that this behavior is showing whatever, or this, quantifying whatever behavior, until we know that this is as objective an evaluation as possible, right? So that was a good point too, at the inter-rater reliability.
And again, we're trying to, at least at this stage, stay away from our definitions having interpretation.
And I think that's the problem that a lot of people find themselves running into, is that they think that a particular behavior means something for their dog, right? And again, one of the common ones that we hear when we're in the dog park and we're video recording dogs, because owners hate this behavior, it's mounting behavior, right? Owners cannot stand when their dog actually mounts another dog or humps another dog. Often what you'll hear is that, well, that's showing the dog's trying to be dominant to the other dog, right? So that is an indicator of dominance. And again, that's probably a whole other show for you. But it's in the dog park, none of our data suggests that that is the interpretation that's likely correct, right? So the interpretation that's supported in the dog park from our data suggests that, well, because there's a relationship between the number of, or the dogs that mount and the dogs that show play behaviors, there's a relationship between the number of play behaviors and the number of mounts, right? So dogs that are mounting other dogs, that seems to be kind of like one of these behaviors that's part of that play repertoire. Owners hate it, and owners will often stop it, and that's fine too if you don't, want to see that or whatever. And of course, some dogs don't want to be mounted, so it's maybe not a bad idea to interrupt that behavior. But in terms of,
if they don't like
if they show that that this is a problem for the other dog, but it doesn't seem to have anything to do with dominance, at least in this context.
Yeah, so a couple of notes on all of that. I think from the trainer perspective, one of the ways that we have sort of wrapped around understanding context and understanding that a behavior can happen in a lot of different contexts, and depending on what the circumstances and these other variables will kind of influence the interpretation, right? And so one of the ways that we worked around that was calling them displacement behaviors. And but by that, I have to say, and this is also my opinion, but I think displacement behaviors often is just a cop out in some cases.
Yep.
It is.
Totally.
Totally.
And it's like, I think that it's almost like we're taking a very complex answer and simplifying it into one word and like, problem solved, right? And I think, unfortunately, even in the dog training community, that happens a lot, where it's almost used as an excuse. Where, it's like, well, no, I know she's stressed because she's shaking, and shaking can be a displacement behavior, so therefore she's stressed. It's like, well, no, and so regarding the mounting behaviors, you're absolutely right. You didn't find that it was sort of a dominant thing. In fact, it had correlation to play. And so one of the things that you wrote was that mounting occurred outside of a sexual context. And so I was wondering if you could walk our audience through how you decide, like how do you look at this and go, this is a sexual context and this is a play context, and that's how we know it's a play context.
So there's kind of two answers to that, and one is that, well, it's really easy, and one is that it's really hard to understand the difference. So the easy part is that, okay, if I see a dog mounting and I know that the female that's being mounted is in heat, and I know that the male that's mounting is intact, well, I'm pretty sure that's a sexual context, right? So that's a clear-cut case of that. It's unlikely to involve, play behavior when it's sexual, right? Although, like, in terms of the, breeding whole interactions between males and females, like, sometimes there's components of that. It's not always again, you can't, it's really difficult a priori. So so what happens? Most of the dogs in the dog park are neutered or spayed, right? So over 80% of all the dogs that we have in our samples, are neutered or spayed, which is typical of pet population in North America. And so is the sexual component completely gone? Right? So they're not intact. There's no females in heat. The males are not intact. They're neutered. Does that mean that there's no elements of sexual behavior at all? I don't know that we can say that's particularly, for sure.
There may be a sexual pleasure.
There's sexual pleasure. So we all probably, I had a dachshund mix years ago who had a real affinity for my children's large stuffed toys, right? And so, that behavior, we saw that mounting behavior in him that may have been involved. There might have been a sexual component involved there. And he was neutered, of course. So it's hard for us to say absolutely not, but what we need to,
it's not reproductively directed.
Yeah, that's right. So it wouldn't actually be a reproductive act, whereas in the other context it would be. So I'm not also saying, I want to be careful or be clear that I'm not suggesting that if we can convincingly show or demonstrate with data that there may be differences in sort of social rank, or what I now call social rank inequalities or asymmetries between two dogs, which may happen. If that mounting behavior was seen consistently in one direction from one dog mounting another direction, and then let's say it was two males, and like we could pretty much be sure that they're, maybe they're neutered, there's not necessarily a sexual reproductive component in it, does that preclude the fact that mounting might not be used as part of the expression of that social rank asymmetry? No, of course not, right? It may, in fact. So again, it's context specific.
And we need the numbers.
Yeah. We don't have those
in the different contexts. And in terms of the other part about sexuality, I would say is that if you have an intact dog and a neutered dog, or a female who's not in heat, if the female doesn't want to participate, that's another indicator.
That is not sexual. That's not reproductive. Yeah.
So I mean, I think there can be individual dogs that are forcing themselves on others, but we don't see a lot of that. Period.
Yeah. It's actually not a frequent behavior in our video. Small numbers do it. The dogs that do it tend to have they're almost, I would describe them as being highly playful. They're almost like they're in overdrive, right? They're really into stuff. And so you think of this Lorenz, who was one of sort of the fathers of ethology, Conrad Lorenz, had a lot of ideas about dogs and retracted some of them, by the way. I don't know if a lot of people know that later on in his life, he kind of took back some of the things that he said in his earlier career. But one of his models that was used originally in ethology was kind of like a hydraulic model, where if you think of water spilling over, right? So sometimes we have these different motivation systems where, one is sexual maybe, and one maybe, social and, involved play. And you might get this, spilling over of one system into another. And again, that's where this displacement activity, you mentioned displacement behaviors, that's where this comes from, right? It's the appearance of a behavior that makes no sense in a given context, right? Where you see a sexual behavior in the context of a non-sexual situation, and some people would describe that as a displacement behavior. You're right?
On the other hand, one of the definitions of play behavior is activities that occur outside of their normal context. Mounting is a classic, fits that definition perfectly.
Absolutely, and of course with play we see all kinds of behaviors, right, that
chasing
occur in other contexts, that almost
biting.
Aggressive, right, biting behaviors that are not. And so play is trickier in some ways than some other
mounting
behavior systems.
So as far as like whether or not people should intervene in there, I feel like that's a conversation for another day. It's highly dependent on the circumstances and the dog, and there's just too many variables to just be like yes or no, right? But if people go to the dog park, or let me rephrase this question. If a person has never been to the dog park before and they think their dog might be the right fit for it, right? When they go in, A, how likely should they anticipate that another dog might try to mount their dog? And B, if it does, should it automatically be alarming to them? Can you answer that question, maybe?
I think it's a low probability event in the first place. I think it was 4% that we saw. So that's certainly greater than 0, but a low probability event. And I think this is personal. We don't have any data on how we ought to behave either. But I'd like to let the dogs figure this one out. But if one of the dogs is showing that they're uncomfortable with something and can't handle it, of course.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of goes beyond some of the science that we the data that we have into like, okay, well, what might be sort of based on what we see overall, sort of some of the interpretations that might be useful for owners, and I think intervene. I would say watch your dog. Watch the other dogs that your dog is interacting with. And one of the complaints that, like, speaking to owners in the dog parks, sometimes one of the complaints is that other owners are not as vigilant about their dog's behavior as, they would want them to be. And I think that's a really important thing. So I think, even though dog parks are great places for us humans to socialize with each other, you always want to have that one eye on the dogs to ensure that, they are actually, everything's going okay. I think, mounting happens. And as Rita said, if the dogs, if it's no big deal for the dogs and they're running off, so there's a mounting and they run off and they're doing something else and they run back here and whatever, I wouldn't get, we're too worried about it unless it started to become a situation that was clear that the dog that was being mounted in particular, but maybe even the dog that's doing the mounting was kind of getting aroused or, uncomfortable, didn't like that, or whatever. Then sure, intervene. Yeah.
So the other thing I did want to say, when you set up that scenario, if I have never been to a dog park and I'm thinking about bringing my dog there, I would recommend, again, no data, but I certainly would recommend going to the dog park on your own and finding out what is going on there, so that when you arrive with your dog, you have a clue.
Yes.
And before, if you decide I'm going to bring my dog to the dog park, before you actually go in, check out what the other dogs are doing, right? Is this the type, because the dogs that are there are going to change every day probably, right? And so see, okay, how are these dogs interacting? Am I seeing anything that makes me uncomfortable as the owner of this particular dog? Do I think my dog is a good match for the dogs that are already there? And don't be afraid to say, okay, we'll come back another day if something makes you uncomfortable about what's going on.
Do your homework.
Yeah. But you have to be your dog's advocate in that sense. Yeah. But I think that point too, because Rita mentioned, we were chatting about this a while ago, it's important to see how your dog, as you're going to the dog park, before you can get in, how's your dog reacting? Like, is this something that it looks like that your dog wants to do? Or is it something that your dog is kind of like, I don't want to go. And you're saying, oh, come on, it's going to be fine. Like, really, I think the onus is on us to, be responsive to what our dog's needs are, not what our desire is, right? Oh, I drove all this way, now you're going in, right? That's not going to be necessarily a good situation, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, I kind of accidentally did this, but since we're talking about a new dog into a new environment, that sort of thing, we're going to circle back to the idea of novelty and sort of the idea that a new variable is what's increasing cortisol, not single-handedly, but it can, right? And so this was reflected in a collective amount of data, not just yours, but just collected together. And so I guess my question is that is the novelty something that we should try to desensitize or try to control the amount of novelty? So for example, like obviously if it's the first time to the dog park, that in and of itself is novel, right? But maybe it's the dog has been there like 1 or 2 times. So now there are things about this that are more familiar, and maybe they've even gone a couple of times within a week span, right? So now this thing is starting to become more familiar, but each time maybe you're adding a new variable, which is there's either more dogs or it's a new time of day or there's new objects in the space, right? So is it that we should be perhaps controlling the amount of new that they get at one time and sort of introduce it? Or do you think that it's like, well, everything's going to be new, so you might as well just give it to them, and then eventually it's all going to be familiar anyway? Like, I guess my question is regarding cortisol, what do you think would be better?
So I would say it depends on the dog,
Me
right?
too.
So that's the story. I think that's
always-
the take-home message for any of these questions. It depends on your dog, right? And there are some dogs, and we know them, right? They're bomb-proof. Like right from a very young age, like they could be taken anywhere. They're so temperamentally stable, like nothing phases them. You know, even those dogs, you want to be careful because sometimes, you don't want to push them too far. But, it doesn't matter. Whatever. And if your dog is like that, then I don't know that you would have to kind of do that gradual introduction. What you're describing is probably not a bad idea. Again, no one's got any data on that particular situation in terms of does that improve or does that change the cortisol levels of the dog in the dog park. It'd be a neat study to do, actually, but we don't know, right? Given that, I think that cortisol does respond to novelty, the prediction might be, like the hypothesis would be that, that might actually help lower the overall cortisol level. Or if it doesn't, because cortisol might still stay high because the dog is aroused and excited to be in the dog park, right? It's a positive thing. Then, you're still kind of gently breaking the novelty of the situation, I guess, to the dog. And if the dog needs that, I think that's not a bad kind of thing to try out, right? To kind of introduce gradually that novelty. It sounds like a good idea to me, but again, there are no data.
I think the other side of the story, we're focusing on the dog, which I think is important. It's got to be the dog's, the dog has a final word at one level. But if I'm an owner and I'm not sure of my dog's response, I'm going to be communicating that to my dog.
Yeah.
They're very good at reading us.
Yeah.
And so it might be very important for the owner to do it gradually.
Yeah. To build their own confidence.
To build their own confidence so that feedback.
That's a good point. I like that.
Yeah.
And there is work, not necessarily a little bit from our lab, but some work from Rose Strauss's, Rose's last name, Rosemary Strasser's lab, where they've shown some hormonal synchrony between owners and their dogs. And so, I think, most of us would suggest that when we're uptight, our dogs, probably respond differently or behave differently, like when we're anxious, but versus when we're all calm and confident. And so that's probably not a big surprise. But I think that's a good point, that if you're not comfortable in the dog park, then you want to make sure that you get yourself to a point where you kind of have a feeling you know what's going on, and then maybe introduce your dog. Yeah. And always watching, right? I think that's the biggest point, right? Is that we really want to become experts in our own dogs. And Mark Beckhoff talks a lot about that with dog parks, that start knowing your dog and how your dog is responding. And, if you think the dog is not having a good time, then just leave, right? Just take I do worry sometimes that owners have sort of a social pressure where they feel like, if my dog can't go to the dog park, then there's something wrong, right? This is not a social dog, and, gosh, what did I do wrong? That's not true. I don't think that's true at all. I don't think that has any validity. There's some dogs, do well in that kind of setting, and it probably has benefits for them in terms of exercise and, interaction. It's probably, a good thing, but not all dogs necessarily are going to enjoy that. And you kind of have to accept the dog that you have, whether, you want to go to the dog park or not, right? So,
and if you want to and your dog doesn't,
go by yourself.
Go by yourself, find another dog to partner with for a while.
That's right. Yeah.
And that definitely is a huge variable to not just your sample, but to dog parks in general. And that is that by and large, most people that know that their dog wouldn't be a fit are not taking their dog. I mean, there's always like margin of error, right?
Yeah.
But by
Nothing's
and large, the communities that are going to dog parks are well socialized dogs, and so I think that sort of is perhaps the opposite of the story, which is that every single time you take your dog to the dog park, inevitably there's going to be a dog fight, and you're just going to walk out bruises everywhere, right? And so we're gonna kind of tackle that story in a second, but I do want to start off with the evidence, which is just that aggressive behavior happens very minimally, and that's not just recorded in your data, but that's recorded elsewhere as well. In fact, you wrote virtually absent. And so how do you think the unlikelihood of an aggressive event is correlated to the population of the dogs that are showing extroversion and overall are friendly and sociable, and what's the correlation there? Or is there even a correlation? Do you think it's a coincidence?
No, I don't think it's a coincidence. I think, so in psychology, we talk about populations being self-selected. So I think we do see some evidence that people who bring their dogs to the dog park are self-selected, right? That they know that, or they can't believe that their dog is sort of going to do well in the dog park. They maybe have experience of bringing the dog, and they've observed that the dog does pretty good in the dog park and plays, seems to be having fun. And I think those are the people that are most likely.
Go to the dog park with their dogs, and their dogs are friends.
Yeah, and that's right. So that's the other thing that we see. And I think, a lot of dog parks see that people kind of do meet up with the regulars, right? They become regulars, and they'll meet up at certain times or whatever. But
in fact, there was an Anthrozoos paper on the sociology of the humans going to dog parks.
So I think you're right, that by and large, it becomes kind of like people who have a dog that doesn't get along well. I think in this paper that we were just talking about, that looked at sort of the human experience of dog parks, people kind of will censure other dogs that aren't getting along well. So they'll sort of suggest to owners very often that their dog doesn't belong there, So, I think it does become a place where you tend, by and large, to get well socialized, active dogs that, have a good experience there. So I think you're right that is what's often happening.
I don't know if this analogy works, but I mean, if I have a kid going to kindergarten, they're mandated to go to school, et cetera, and they get socialized. Some have a harder time than others, but they have to go.
Yeah.
The dog park, on the other hand, you don't have to go.
Yeah.
But if you go and it's a good socializing experience, it's wonderful. Otherwise, you don't go.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think you do want to still be on the lookout for that owner that's not as kind of, clued into what their dog is doing, and, maybe doesn't understand or doesn't see that their dog is kind of not happy or stressed out, right? Showing these behaviors where it's indicated like leave me alone maybe or whatever. So yeah, I think you do still want to be on the lookout for that, and you just do still want to watch your dog. I mean, even if it's with familiar dogs, right?
And for a lot of the owners, part of the pleasure is watching their dogs interact with other dogs.
Yeah.
I mean, you just watch them.
Yeah.
Keeping track. I'll go and watch dogs.
Yeah.
Running and playing. It's lovely.
Great. Yeah, it's lots of fun.
It's funny you say that, because honestly, like I have done this experiment myself. I did this, early on when I was just trying to figure out dogs, and I'm doing this when as a trainer. And it's incredibly, my experience, my emotional takeaway when I walk out is highly dependent on the dogs and people in the area at that time. And, I've walked away sometimes being like, oh my gosh, everybody should be taking their dog to the dog park. This is the greatest thing in the world. And then other times I've walked away and I've just been having an internal panic attack, right?
Right.
And so I think that something I personally try to encourage my clients to do is that, yeah, you do need to go ahead of time before you take your dog. That's important. But in a perfect world, you're actually going several times, right? Because the more you go, the more you're getting information. And one time, one experience is not going to be very representative of all of the other possible experiences you could have. And so I have done that myself. And I have to say, like, there was one time as a trainer that I went and I was just like, oh my God, I'm never letting a dog go to a dog park again. This is the worst thing, right? And I had to like check myself and be like, wait a minute, you know? Okay, so, you know, regarding some of those more horror stories, right? And if you're going back to the new puppy owner, she's got her 4 or 5 month old puppy, golden retriever, super friendly, right? Has by all accounts is on the right path, yes. But when she's considering going to the dog park, the things that she pulls up on Google are that, you know, there's a dog fight over here, there's Giardia over there, and there's, you know, all of this. And I know I don't want to kind of digress on the medical issues because that's a conversation for a different day, but as far as like the likelihood of these aggressions happening, we know that it's slim. But the stories are really freaking scary. And when you hear these things, you're just like, oh my God, my golden retriever shouldn't be in that space, right? So first of all, you know, this is a hard question, but what validity do you think people should give those stories? And secondly, when they're reading those stories, what else should they be thinking of to kind of give more context?
Right.
I want to give the psychology here first.
Yes. Go.
You know, there actually is quite a database in the social psychology and decision-making literature. Yeah. And I'll be really boring and concrete. Brand Model X of a car has a fabulous safety record, repair record. Owners are very happy with it, etc. So I decide I'm going to buy this car, this type of car. And then I hear my neighbor says, oh, don't you ever do that. I got it. I had it was a lemon. It did all these horrible things. And you're swayed by one story out of thousands.
Yeah.
You completely go with but I had this experience thing. We do that a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know how to get over it, but one story from a known person or a news thing carries a phenomenal weight and just dominates a baseline that is very, very stable. Yeah. We all know that there are lemons. We all know that there are bad people, bad dogs, bad this, bad that. But they're very rare.
So I agree, and I think like our social psychology colleagues in this department would suggest, like, you know, this is really around the fact that humans are pretty bad at risk perception. Like, we are not good at like relative risk, and so we have these phenomena that they talk about in social psychology, like confirmation bias, right? So it's like if you have an experience like Rita's saying, then we're actually kind of, the way our mind works, or brain works, is like we pay more attention to the events that confirm what we already know, right? Like, oh, that car was terrible, like Rita's example was, right? Or, oh, dog parks are a bad place because I know somebody whose dog got attacked or had a fight or whatever, right? And so we often are programmed or like predisposed to look for those things that confirm what we know, as opposed to sort of like from a statistical perspective, like the risks are probably pretty low. The classic case is like air travel too, right? You know, like how many flights around the world are happening every single day? I mean, there are actual numbers on this. I just don't know them. But, you know, there's millions, right? And then like how many, you know, airplane crashes actually happen? Like it's teeny percentages, right? And so, but those can actually, for some people in particular, really outweigh, like, you know, outbalance, you know, what actually the reality is.
So reality, I mean, that is reality, but if you happen to be part of one of those bad things, it's personally really bad.
Yeah.
No denying that.
Oh yeah, and we're not denying that there are definitely real things that people have bad experiences in dog parks. That totally happens, of course. But
It's just
in the
really
big
unlikely.
picture, the relative risk is pretty low, right? And I think, it's not just our work that we have now, like, probably, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of videotape from multiple years, right? We just don't
Many
get
different
dog
dogs.
fighting. We don't, and these are not the same dogs. These are dogs. We don't see fights in the dog park. The small number of papers that have been published, on dog parks, you don't see it. So we're not unique in saying that our dogs don't fight in the dog park. We don't see a lot of aggression. Nobody who's looked at this sees a high degree of aggression.
And again, there is probably a lot of self-selection.
Yeah.
But that's true of
Yeah.
almost everything that we as humans engage in.
Yeah.
We choose to do particular things or not.
Yeah. So the risk is never zero, that there's not going to be, a fight or aggression or whatever. It's never zero. Of course, it's never zero. But it's also not going to be very high, right? And it may depend on, like you say, the time of day that you go and how many dogs are there. It may depend on all these factors. We don't know, because there's not been any real comprehensive analysis of that, just because it's such a rare event.
But the bottom line is that the dog has got to gain from going there.
Yeah.
They need to be voting with their feet.
Yeah.
And behavior.
So, transferring over into your 2018 paper, which actually precedes the other paper
Right.
in real time, you guys had looked at the first 400 seconds, which works out to be about 6.5-ish minutes, right? First 400 seconds of a dog entering the park. So from the time that literally a gate opens, right? And so I do want to clarify for our audience that it's not the time that they get out of the car and they're walking to the gate. It's literally the time that they walk from the gate opens and they're now on the dog park, right?
That's right.
So this study was focusing on time budgets, and specifically that is where they spend their time. Is it with the group? Is it, and group being with humans and with dogs? Is it just with dogs? Is it with people? So focus on that. The other thing it focused on is obviously behavior. And it also focused on whether or not the dogs were touching each other, or if they were using sort of visual cues, if you will, or visual signals, right? And so first of all, the first question is, why 400 seconds? Like, what was distinct about this initial walking through the gate that seems to be relevant, or I guess important to look at, as opposed to the whole time budget?
Yeah.
2 answers.
Yeah.
At least.
Yeah.
Go.
So the first thing is that you're right. That was the first study that we did in the dog park. So we probably now, with 2020 hindsight vision, change some of the things that we might have done initially. So what Mel House did, and this was her master's work, was she just recorded dogs as they were coming into the dog park. I guess she started doing it, even though on the video they probably have them coming up to the gates. We only started recording, or she started recording behavior, coding behavior, when the gate opened, because that is what's going to indicate if the dog has an opportunity to engage with other dogs. So that's the reason why you start when the gate opens, because that's when you're going to get the first opportunity to have dog-dog interaction in a meaningful way anyways. And then the 400 seconds, because the dogs stayed various lengths of time. Some dogs come in and are only there for a short period of time. Some dogs stay there for longer periods of time. She decided that was what was in common to all the videos that she had, was she could code a local dog behavior for that first 400 seconds.
And have all of the dogs that she had.
Yeah, the full sample that she had
videotape on, rather than, because as you went out in time, you'd be losing. Yeah.
So the dogs that didn't stay longer than that, there was a bunch of them that left after that time period or whatever. So it was a kind of a practical decision. And in later studies, we did do longer periods of time, like 20 minutes or whatever. It turns out, though, because she was just kind of doing,
The first
whatever
check.
people did, right, when they came in the dog park or whatever, they on average stayed just around 20 minutes. So the average dog park visit, according to her data, was about 22 minutes, I think, right? And there was some stayed longer, some stayed shorter. But in later studies, that's the reason why we actually started using 20 minutes, was because that reflects about an average dog park visit for most dogs. Yeah.
But fortunately for her, a lot of very interesting things happen in that initial entry period.
Yeah.
And some honor students have actually focused much more on
Those,
that time period as well. Because, of course, you go to a party, you enter, and there it all is. And that sets the stage for a lot of things. So,
Right. And so one of the things that you found was that in the first 6 minutes, about 50% of the time, dogs spent alone, which I find fascinating. And then,
Oh, I was going to say some of that, it isn't necessarily that they spend time alone, but they're transitioning, because you're alone if you're 1.5 dog lengths away from anyone else. So, I mean, yes, they are alone, but they're not, some of that time, they're just transitioning.
Yeah, between different activities.
Yeah.
That's an excellent clarification. 50% of the time was alone. 40% of it was just dogs. About 7% was with just humans, and 3% was a combination of both. So specifically looking at the first minute, 60% of this was spent with at least one other dog, and then it sort of dissipated throughout the rest of it. Now, the reasonable conclusion of that is just that all of the dogs flood the gate when the newcomer walks in. All of the dogs that are already in the dog cart approach, right? This puts them together, and then they sort of, as that initial like, hi, hello, how are you moment ends, then they all go out there and do their thing, right? So my question is that many dog owners would think that this initial like meet and greet at the gate is somehow like scary for the newcomer. And I don't really want to get too much on sort of applying function to that moment, and sort of insinuate whether it's scary or not, because I think that that's contextualization, as we just talked about. But I more want to know, like, one of the things that you guys pointed out was that initial meet and greet, the newcomer is only able to put their nose to one dog or smell, like touching one dog at a time, whereas a bunch of other dogs can touch them, right? And so one of the things that she said was that he's just smelling one dog, and the reality is that he's smelling a lot of things, but he's just touching one dog, right, at a time. So my question is do you think that is a normal thing to be expected and not encouraged, but allowed? Or do you think that we should sort of have the newcomer approach and sort of do one at a time and not be touched by all of these things? Do you think it's impairing the information they're getting? Or do you not know, because we haven't studied that?
No, I really don't know, but I would say that there's some synergy that's going on. Of what sort, I don't know. But if I come into a room and several people come up to greet me, most of the time, and it's generally a positive feeling, I would be picking up on the positive vibes and the big smiles on everyone's face. I don't know, I'm not a dog, I don't know what it is like, but if you're used to that situation, you might even know a couple of the individuals, I would think that it would be an upper, and being restrained to do one after another would be really frustrating.
Yeah.
It'd be like being in a reception line.
Yeah.
And no data, absolutely no data, just gut feeling.
Yeah. And I think just in our study, what would happen is that the owners, almost without exception, and I think in Mel's paper, she actually says if there was an exception, but the leash comes off as soon as the dog is in the park. And so there's no sort of, control over what's going on there, right? So
in fact, it's when they're unclipped that time starts.
That's right. So the gates and the unclip. But the question around, like, do you think that the information they're getting is being impaired? I don't think so. Because, I mean, their olfactory apparatus is so refined, right? I mean, there's no question, right, that they are getting information. And what's happening, you're right, most of what's going on with all this sniffing behavior is chemosensory information, right? And we would love to know what they are actually taking home, what messages they're taking home from those dogs. But we know, and all of them, it's ubiquitous, meaning all the dogs are doing that. You were absolutely right that's the initial thing that usually happens when a new dog comes in. Everybody's like, oh, come on, let's check it out, right? So they all start running over to the gate, and there's lots of the sniffing. Very often, though, it's pretty brief, right? Like, it doesn't take a long time for them to gather the information, that presumably they need. And again, who knows what that information is. I mean, we speculate that it's likely got to do with the sex of the dog that's coming in. They probably can tell if the dog is spayed or neutered. They probably can tell something about age, and they probably can tell something about the level of arousal or stress, if you want, that the dog is actually experiencing. And how those things influence what they do next is a good question. We don't know, right? But often this is really brief. It's interesting. I know that Annika Lisberg, who did some work on dog park entries a few years ago, and some of this was data that she reported at an IFAB conference a few years ago. I can't remember the year, but Patricia McConnell actually wrote about some of this work in one of her blogs. But what she thought was that some dogs will enter a dog park and then they'll almost immediately squat and pee or lift their leg and urinate, and that this may be a way of getting other dogs to smell the urine as opposed to smelling them, and that might be a way of transmitting that information. So that was some really interesting ideas that she had around
I haven't seen anything since then.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that got published, but yeah, and we actually had some students that started looking for that as well. It is a fascinating, though, this whole initial kind of thing that happens. But again, most of in our data, it seems really brief. Like, that is like no longer than 10 seconds, and then they're gone again, right? Yeah, we'd love to know what information they're getting.
Yeah. And I mean, I have to say that, like, the dog trainer in me, I made a mistake. I made a human mistake, and I had to fix myself, right? When I read that they sort of separated, I thought, oh, okay, well, that's so they can express stress. That's so that they can all calm down, right? And I was like, wait a minute.
So I was just going to jump in and say that, you say we know that time with other dogs goes down and alone goes up. Well, of course, you're at the gate.
Yeah.
There's the whole dog park to explore and find out what's on the go now. So of course, once that initial bout is over, some dogs will go off and explore the area to figure out, okay, now what am I going to do?
Yeah.
Others might engage in play. Others might engage in whatever.
Yeah. But I do have to say that when we first started looking at the data in terms of the time budget, how the dogs spend their time in the dog park,
It was
I was surprised.
Yeah,
we were surprised that they spent a significant portion of their time alone. And so even in Lydia's later work, where she looked at the full 20-minute it was still about 40% of their time alone. And as Rita said, some of this is going between activities, right? But they do alone time in the dog park. And I guess my bias before really doing this work was that, oh yeah, dogs are social and they're spending all their time having the opportunity to engage with other dogs, particularly if they come from a single dog house and they don't have other canine play partners or whatever. But no, it turns out that even across a full 20-minute dog park visit, they're still spending a significant amount of time.
And in all honesty, I mean, I just, if I were there engaged in intense chase, I need to take a break.
Yeah.
Catch my breath.
Yeah.
And then we can have another bout.
Yeah. Some of it's like that. Yeah.
So I mean, there's that type of time. There's the exploring time. There's the elimination time. There's a lot of stuff that can go on that happens alone, which is still part of the social event of being at the dog park.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you guys are looking at, because particularly you were looking at how frequently and in what context the dogs touch each other, like literally touch each other, right? And so one of the things you guys said was the frequency of initiating head contact with other dogs was higher for younger dogs, perhaps reflecting that snout muzzle contact with the head may function as attempts to form or enhance social bonds with another dog. And so, well, first of all, when I read that, I was like, I need more information. I was like, so can you, so first of all, can you just sort of expand on what that means?
Sure.
What yeah.
Alternative hypotheses are.
Yeah. So what Mel found was there seemed to be an age effect, that younger dogs seemed to be the ones that were initiating or doing more of that. She called it snout muzzle contact, right, where they were sniffing other dogs' heads. And relative to older dogs, younger dogs were initiating that more. We don't have any other studies to compare that finding to, because they haven't been looked at. That hasn't been looked at. So I would say, well, in that sample that she had of her, I think 59 dogs, I can't remember, 60 dogs or whatever she had, this was the relationship that came out, that there was younger dogs seem to do this more often. I would want to see that replicated in other samples. And in fact, we do have those videos that we could get a student to actually do that. It just hasn't been done yet. But I think it's interesting that it's possible. I mean, one of the ideas around that is that it's possible that younger dogs, because we know that puppies, have certain sort of behaviors that they engage in with older dogs, like, licking around their mouths and whatnot. And it's sort of like affiliation behaviors. So maybe that in the dog park context, younger dogs do that behavior towards older dogs. But yeah, we'd like to replicate that as well.
So you also said it might be that, and might as an operative word there, I want to emphasize the might. It might be that tactile signals are likely reserved for specific social partners, while a higher number of dogs present might give dogs greater choice of partners with whom to interact in a physical way. It wouldn't necessarily influence the number of partners chosen on the total number of contact behaviors expressed. So effectively, dogs save physical touching for sort of a level of comfort or a level of understanding, right? Or at least that's what you propose, yeah. So my question is, do you think that this is, since it's a hypothesis and it's a speculation, would you speculate that also to be true in other contexts outside of the dog park, or is that applicable, do you think, for some reason in the dog park?
So I would say that it probably happens in lots of contexts where a dog will have, for lack of a better word, particular types of friends. So where they make sort of friendships. So I think the quote that you took from the paper also involved not only this like snout muzzle contact, but like we do see that some dogs engage in like wrestling, right? It's not, again, not very common, but when we see a dog that wrestles, they don't like wrestle with every other dog in the dog park. They have a partner or two that they engage in wrestling with. We would love to know, how do they choose that partner? Is it that they're more familiar with that partner and they'll engage in that behavior because there's that degree of familiarity? Or is it because, they have maybe they have a history with that type of dog, who knows, right? Or something that seems like that dog and that they've interacted with positively before. So yeah, it's a really good question. But I think it probably could transfer outside the dog park. We don't have data on that. There's lots of anecdotes around that, and you probably know some, your viewers will have some where their dog likes a particular type of dog, but doesn't like other types of dogs that they've had maybe not so positive experiences with. And so that could be part of what figures into who do I actually engage in this type of behavior with. And sometimes it might just actually come down to the day of I'm in the dog park, who's most responsive to, my invitations to play, right? And how do they respond when do I like what they're doing back to me? And if I do, well, then maybe we can continue on and, have this really, eventually this nice wrestling match where everybody is still happy, right? But,
I'm just kind of sitting here thinking about my dog, anecdote, but she and her best friend are engaged in a lot of wrestling behavior and very high level in the woods. And so at some point I thought, well, you have the flexibility to meet other people, other dogs, and be responsive to what they need. I hope so. And just recently we've run into a few other totally different behaviors. So I mean, it's a matter of you and your partner.
Yeah.
I would personally like to know a lot more about, do dogs have interaction styles? Primarily, how flexible are they? And I think they're very good at reading other dogs.
Some dogs
and
are.
what they need, but not all. But I mean, I'd love to know more about that part of the social interaction.
Yeah.
How do you change your behavior in accordance with your partner?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, from my perspective as a trainer, a lot of the dogs that I personally work with are fear-oriented or basing in some sort of concern for my presence, right? And so if anything, me touching them would be offensive and alarming to them. And so as I start to build relationships with these dogs, right, through the training process, it's always interesting to me to see whether the dogs start to ask for me to touch them or not. And I'm constantly always reminding myself that just because they're saying they don't want me to touch them doesn't necessarily mean that they don't appreciate, that they're concerned about me, or that they are alarmed by me. That me touching them is not single-handedly showing me displaying affection or love to them, right? Everybody in a very, I guess, a broad sense, everybody is going to receive love in a different way. And so it's reasonable to assume that a dog may not necessarily receive love by being touched.
Right.
And so when I read that, I was just like, I hadn't thought of it in the context of like dogs saving their play strategies for a degree of comfortability or understanding between the dogs. I hadn't really thought that through, but it totally made sense because I know that dogs do it with humans all the time, right? There are some dogs, the 4-month-old golden retriever that just sees a person is like, pet me, right? And then you see other dogs that are perfectly happy that you're there. They care about you, they love you, but they're not gonna want you to touch them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so one of the things that I found interesting within all of your research was just that you made a couple of references to sort of the human intervention within the park, right? Whether it was direct intervention or indirect intervention, but just sort of the idea that, like, for example, with the mounting, dogs would call their dogs off and intervene. You mentioned that people are really only bringing social dogs to the park. There's not too many people bringing their reactive dog in, right? And so this sort of made me wonder your personal opinions on this, and that is that do you think that human owners are intuitively able to decide whether or not their dog is a good fit, or is intuitively able to intervene? Like, I guess I'm just sort of trying to understand the amount of confidence we can give in the common owner to be able to problem solve this.
Yeah. I think you raise a really good point. And in fact, there are some papers that have looked at how good owners are at perceiving behaviors in their dogs. For example, Sherry Mariti, who's in Italy, she's looked at, how good are owners at perceiving certain stress-related behaviors, or what we might think of as stress-related behaviors. And they're good at some behaviors and are really bad at detecting other behaviors, right? Yeah. So I think, and also out of Lee Neal's lab in University of Guelph, there's been some work, some of our students have looked at, the effect of training, like getting people to learn using video or whatever, sort of what behaviors might be indicators of other, emotional states or whatever, stress or whatever. And there you can improve. So owners can learn to become better at detecting behaviors and, learning what those behaviors may indicate for their dog. I think it's possible that that is a skill that can be developed. And we know it's a skill because we even know, like as researchers in our own labs, we train our students when they first come in as undergraduates or new graduate students, they go through a process of learning to observe, right? And we call it, you get your eye in, where you start getting skilled at detecting behavioral patterns, and then being able to kind of be reliably good at doing that. And it's a learning curve, right? So I think there's a learning process. So there is, I would say, I wouldn't say that there's no intuitive process at all. So I think intuition can play a role, but it's also a learned skill that I think if owners are interested, they can get good at. But I wouldn't say that there's no role for going with a gut feeling. Whereas if your dog is interacting in a way and your gut feeling is that, I'm not sure this is a good idea, then, my advice would be maybe follow your intuition in that case. But I think it can't replace trying to train yourself or be trained in terms of developing the skill of observing your dog, knowing your dog's behavior. Yeah.
Yeah. What I wanted to add, I have a lot of data on people observing wolf social interactions.
Yeah.
That are play and more playful and more aggressive. And if the wolf faces are prominent, they're very good at identifying whether it's more friendly or less friendly. If the faces are not prominent, people tend to see playful and aggressive hip slams as all playful.
Mm-hmm.
They're not good at reading the body postures. Now, and we haven't found that to change as a function of dog ownership, wildlife, whatever. But that's just the visuals. So I don't know about the intuition, but faces, we seem to be really, really sensitive to the information that is conveyed in canine facial expression.
Yeah. And owners will also bring their own biases to how they interpret, how they see. And so a lot of what we do when we're training students is we're trying to become aware of any biases that we might be bringing and remove them, right? And so we're going for real objective, in the case of research, abilities or objective observation of behavior. That's probably not realistic for owners to totally remove their feelings around what their dog is doing. And of course we wouldn't expect it to be, but I think there is a role. You want to kind of be thinking like, okay, do I think like, well, what do I think? Am I bringing this dog to the dog park because I think, I have to? I feel like, it's something that I need to do because if I don't, maybe it's, not good for the dog, or I need to, it has to have a social life or whatever, but I'm not comfortable and I'm not sure about my dog, whatever, so you're probably going to see any behaviors as kind of scary in that case, if that's your mindset, versus people might make the other error and say, oh, this is all, flowers and rainbows, right? It's all a wonderful place. And they might miss seeing things that might be potentially indicators of something's not going as well as it could be. So I think you got to kind of be aware of where you start, where your starting point is. But there is an ability. I'm hopeful that people, if you're serious about really wanting, to know about your dog's behavior, you can learn it. You can definitely train yourself. Yeah.
I think just that, I think it's very important. If it's just you and your dog all of the time, you don't know what the range of behaviors are.
Yeah.
But if you personally went down to the dog park and observed a lot of different dogs and how they're interacting and people, etc., you would probably end up learning a fair amount that you can bring back to think about how your dog is behaving. When your sample is one,
Yeah.
It's hard to appreciate that full range of possibility.
Yeah. Right. That's
Right.
right.
I think one of the issues that I run into a lot is that I'll be asked by either a client or literally sometimes just like a stranger on the street where we get talking or whatever, and they'll start asking me about, like, well, do you think that my dog is stressed? Well, my dog does X, Y, or Z. Like, do you think my dog is stressed? And they usually want me to answer that, and I don't usually,
Right.
because the amount of information I have is so limited. And I know they get frustrated with that answer. They'll email me or DM me, and it's like they perceive it as I'm trying to, like, I don't know, get them to do my services, and so this is like a sales ploy. And honestly, it's about integrity for me. So it's actually the opposite of that. For me, it's more just that if I give you an answer, I'm basically probably setting myself up to be wrong in some capacity, right?
Yeah.
And it's more about making sure that, we're kind of digressing just a second, but you've inadvertently validated one of my main philosophies as a trainer, which is just that my job is not to teach one person to read one dog. That's not really my job. My job is much bigger than that. My job is to teach people that this is the blanket, and you have to now take that blanket and apply it over your dog, right?
Yeah.
So I personally say coach dog owners instead of train dog owners, right? Because I know that's cheesy. But one of the reasons I do that was just because I wanted to reframe the mindset of what my job is. I don't want people thinking that my job is to come in and being like, this is X, Y, and Z, what's happening. And I know that because I am Jenna, right? I want people to be like, this is all the information we have. And now it's your job to apply it to your dog, because no one knows your dog better than you. And so, yes, you can become more educated and make those decisions better than I can, because I've seen your dog once, if at all, right? So I just really appreciated that you're emphasizing that point, which is that it's a combination of both. It's a combination of intuitively knowing your own dog and building a relationship with your dog and having a connection with your dog, in addition to being educated and having this other element to it. And it's a combination that's going to find you the answers, right?
Absolutely.
Lastly, I kind of wanted to pinpoint, I have basically I have one question, but I want to look at it from two angles, okay? Which is one of the things that we wrote in this 2018 paper. I'm going to read it because I'll be honest that when I read it, I literally annotated like amen and preach it. I literally was just like, wow, oh my God. In the introduction of the 2018 published series, it says, virtually no behavioral analyses based on neutral characterizations of dog behavior in social context, which is descriptions and labels of behavior based on form or appearance, not function, have been published. Studies that assess behavior from a motivationally neutral perspective would help provide insight into dog social patterns without making any prior assumptions or confusing description and inference, and would allow functional explanations to emerge from relationships among empirical data. And I was just like,
thank you.
I read that. I just read that and I was like, oh my gosh, that belongs on a shirt. And I was just like, because honestly, it was it was so well encompassing on the fact that it's like, let's not jump to any conclusions. We've done that. We've created all of these narratives and these conclusions, and we've drawn them. But it's like, but really, we need to take a step back and omit all of those until we can actually validate what is true and what isn't. And I can tell you, just as like a human being and sort of like the way my brain works apart from my job, I'm constantly like struggling with this problem, which is just that like I create a story in my head, which, as you say, confirmation bias, and it is, right? And my life sometimes mirrors that confirmation bias. And I have to constantly check myself and be like, wait a minute, right? What is the reality, and what is the broader scope? And more importantly, do we even have the broader scope, right? Which is what you guys point out here, which is that there's a lot missing from what we know and what we know, right? And so one of the variables that was, I guess, missing from your guys' research was just sort of like how many trees would get affected, how many dogs are going to affect it, or if there are toys, are these results going to be affected in that capacity, right? So there were a lot of different variables that we have to look at and sort of, for example, research guarding, when we're talking about aggression, research guarding of all might potentially increase the likelihood of aggression happening in a dog fight, in a dog park, right? So given that there are all these variables, what do you think, what do you think would be most important to look at? And what do you hypothesize to be sort of the most, I guess, what's the right word for this? But what would you hypothesize to be the most likely outcome of those? Am I making sense?
Yeah.
I mean, I personally have been struck by how poor we are at reading dog behavior, even though we work at it. And so I personally would really like to know a whole lot more about all those postural cues that are available and what they really mean. And that is coding behavior in a context with respect to the other dog in a motivationally neutral manner. That research is starting to happen.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, turning the world around a great deal.
Yeah.
Once we get rid of some of those heavy preconceived notions about dominant, submission, they all come back to that. I think we and our dogs will have a much better life.
Yeah. I think I'm glad that you agree with this approach of trying to take a motivationally neutral perspective. I think it's in some ways it's quite common in other areas of animal behavior to do that. It's not that common at all to do with dogs. And I find that as a researcher really fascinating, because I think, dogs, because they're so close to us as humans, right? I mean, some researchers argue like, well, of course there wouldn't be domestic dogs if it wasn't for humans. So it's like a coevolution potentially has happened, right? Over, maybe 100,000 years or more, right? And so we often it's very easy for us to make assumptions about what we know about our dog's behavior. That's been helped along, like in the last, century or so, by some ideas that are probably misguided or misinformed, right? In terms of ascribing motivation to behavior. So I think we are making strides, and like we chatted a little bit earlier about some new studies that have started now looking at the functions of rollover behavior and looking at the potential functions of play bow behavior. And, what we thought about those behaviors may not be the absolute truth, right? And so it's a constant updating and trying to take this approach to say, let's ask the question and let's get the data. Around the dog park question that you asked, what else do we need to know? I think it's a really good point, because most of our work has been in this one single dog park, because it really was only one dog park when we started. And that's changed here locally. And I think, it has been over we can document it, right? I mean, people have documented like this rise in dog park popularity, and, municipalities, developing dog parks and whatnot. But we still don't know much about what's optimal in terms of designs of dog parks for the dogs. So some of the work that's been done that's published around dog park design is all looking at features from the perspective of the humans, the owners that go there, right?
Yeah.
Including like making ledges for your Starbucks cup. We can't blame those municipal planners, because there are no data to tell them, here, this is what works for a good dog park, right? We don't know, right?
Right.
But there are, I think, interesting questions that need to be asked. So people have to first ask the question if they're interested in finding the answer. And there's lots of possibilities, right? So, and you probably know, like, dog parks are not any kind of unitary thing. There's all kinds of,
Size,
flavors and variations on the theme. Sometimes it's a beach, right? A stretch of beach that's more linear, right? So it's not very deep, because of the shore and the water or whatever, and so what does that change dog behavior when you have this linear stretch?
Or it's a whole hillside,
wooded area, right? So, I mean, we know that those kinds of features are going to change things like the capacity of dogs to see visual behaviors in other dogs, right? So our prediction would be, or one prediction could be that, if you were in a wooded area, the type of behavior you see might look different than if you're on a beach that has a wide open vista, right? And you can see for miles, kind of thing. The other thing I know, like in here in Canada, in Calgary in particular, and there's other places though, of course, there's some some of the off-leash dog areas are like linear parks. They call them linear parks. So it's more of a linear kind of walking trail, where an owner and a dog, instead of sort of, plumping yourself down on a bench and watching your dog interact in this big, rectangle fenced area or whatever, you're walking with your dog, and you're kind of like, there's movement or whatever. And that probably influences how the dogs that are all there off lead are interacting with each other, right? They're not now in one spot, they're not coming back to check in with you because you're moving with them, right? So there's all these great questions, I think, that just have not been addressed in the literature.
This is hypothetical, but up until maybe 50 years ago, most dogs, I shouldn't say most, a lot of them were working dogs. They were doing their thing. They weren't living in intensely populated areas. Now we have a very large dog population. 1 in 4 households have dogs. They're urban dogs. It's become very, very important for us to actually understand how we can interact with our dogs in ways that in the old days, the dog figured out what their job was and they did it. And you got together and you had a good time, but it wasn't this intense social world that we all inhabit now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that it's become apparent that we don't know a lot about dog communication, because it's become much more important that we get it right.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this is really these questions, this research. I mean, I guess some people, maybe not you, because this is what you do, you're interested in dogs, right? But a lot of people wonder, well, isn't that a little bit esoteric, or who really cares about research in dog parks? But, and so my perspective on it, or my answer to that is no, it affects dog welfare is really at the heart of what we're interested in, right? Not that we're specifically necessarily translating that directly to it's not a welfare project per se, but just the well-being of, like Rita said, most dogs are urban dogs that for 8 or 9 hours a day may be alone in a house, right? And so I think part of the popularity of dog parks is probably related to that, that people need outlets for their dogs, or are looking for outlets for their dogs to, take them somewhere and enrich their lives. And it's not necessarily the case that that is actually an enrichment for all dogs, right? And wouldn't we like to know what features might actually contribute to dog welfare, right? And the data are so sparse that no one can really talk about that. We can make guesses, right? And sometimes that's good, but it'd be great if we had more data. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
think one of the interesting variables is that like a lot of the positive training community is going to call themselves evidence-based. And I think one of the ironic things about using that phrase is how little evidence there really is. So it's like you can call yourself evidence-based, but it's like evidence-based off of what? Because it's few pickings over here, right? And so one of the arguments against evidence-based training is just that it's like, well, I don't need science to tell me how to read my dog. I have my eyes. Right. And so there are a lot of trainers that are like, well, I don't need this information because I'm doing it. I have my eyes and it's working. Right. And, on one hand, it's like, on one hand, they're saying, well, I have my eyes. And so the irony of using that is just that we say we have our eyes too. And we're saying we're using observable information. Right. And so it sort of depends on how you're looking at that phrase to kind of going to greatly influence the outcome of it. Right. And it's making sure, as you pointed out with your students, which is that you're using your eyes, but you're eliminating a lot of stuff when you're using just your eyes, right? It's about being, I guess, intelligent enough to be able to omit a whole part of your perspective, right? And that's something that even in the evidence-based community, we struggle with, where we want to believe that something is the way it is. And so we believe that a yawn is stress just because we've been told it's stress, right? Well, it's like, well, what evidence is telling you that yawn is stressful? We need to be able to be a little bit more nuanced than just saying it's stress, right? So we're going to wrap up in a second, but I have a fairly broad question, and so you can answer it very broadly. And I hope that your audience already understands that this is a very broad, generalized answer. Okay, please do not take this as like specific. But I would like you to describe the ideal dog without necessarily thinking about medical. Assuming the dog is the healthiest dog, we're not taking into any of that account. Okay, from a behavioral standpoint. What would be the ideal dog for a dog park? No, it's a hard question. I know.
It's a bit of a hard question. So based on trying to think of, extrapolating from the data that we actually have, because, it's interesting you're describing, this difference in sort of trainers who believe that they use their eyes and then they use that information to, go confirm or go with what they know, they believe, and versus people who are using their eyes to like kind of evaluate data, right? And so there's different ways, I agree with you, of sort of trying to do that. And part of, we are actually trying to use the scientific method, right? This is what we are using to evaluate hypotheses, to come up with predictions, and to actually let the data speak for themselves, as opposed to, some of those times it does confirm what I believe about dog behavior, which is the opposite side of the coin, right? And other times it doesn't. So I'm going to ignore the times that it doesn't. I'm going to just go with the things that, fit with what I believe about, right? And that's the non-scientific approach, right? That's a different approach. So to answer your question, though, I want to kind of try to use the data and to say that, so based on what we know about who goes to dog parks and the fact that we have low incidence of aggression in our data, dogs that seem to do well in dog parks, because those seem to be large numbers of the dogs that we actually have, not all of them, they're dogs that are relatively young. So in fact, we see a range of ages in the dogs that go to the dog park in our studies, but they tend to
3,
be
4.
on average about 3 or 4 years old, right? And so we'll see older dogs, but sometimes the older dogs aren't as that interested in playing with other dogs, right? So we do see that there are age effects, right? Yeah.
And sometimes older dogs like to go and lay under the
And
bench and watch.
Yeah. So
Dogs are
there's
good voyeurs.
yeah. So there's differences. These are, again, as you say, broad generalizations that no one should take too seriously, because there's older dogs that, and 7 is not old for a lot of dogs either, right? So I think, but generally speaking, a relatively youngish dog, not a puppy necessarily, right? Because I think there's a lot going on with puppies that they probably don't need to be in a dog park to start, be maturing first a little bit. But, any dog around a year old, maybe into mid, I don't know, before the age of 10. Dogs that are active. So if you actually, and I think that's from a welfare kind of perspective, if you have a dog that seems to be active, well, a dog park might be a really good opportunity for that dog to, engage, right? To be active and to be, lively, or, blow off steam, or however you want to call it, whatever you want to call it. So I think extroversion, so dogs that are a little bit more extroversion, I think if they're sociable, so probably from non-dog park situations how friendly your dog is with other dogs, right? So a dog that is not friendly or not sociable with other dogs, not going to be very happy in a dog park, right? So if the dog is friendly, likes other dogs, interacts well with other dogs, then I think that's probably a pretty good option to take.
Yeah, and I would, go back. I don't want to bring up the negative, but I mean, if you have a very fearful dog, that would not be a priori a good choice.
No.
And saying, oh, it would be good experience. Maybe not.
No. Yeah.
But the bottom line, I think, for me is to remember that all dogs are individuals.
Yeah.
And they really need, it depends upon the dog.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think really paying attention, and I do like this thing, about trying to, Rita calls it let the dog vote with his feet or her feet, right? Like if the dog seems to want to be in that setting, then that's probably a good indicator that that's a positive experience for them. And so I would say that if they're having positive experience, then you're actually taking the dog park, might be promoting their welfare, right? If the dog seems reluctant to go, you're trying to dragging it in, and he's not that happy to be there, you're probably negatively impacting his welfare. Even though you might be trying to do a good thing, you might be saying, oh, I think I'm doing something good for him. Maybe not so much, right? So I think it does boil down to the individual dog. You have to be sensitive to it.
And just to add on that, I mean, even if, let's say the dog does want to go in the dog park, you take him into the dog park and everything seems to be going well, and then suddenly you're starting to notice that maybe he's not as comfortable there now as he was when he started off, that his opinion is changing. There's nothing wrong with taking him out and seeing if he wants to go back in. Like, to me, there's more harm in keeping him there when you think, well, maybe, right, than there is just to take him out, pause for a second, and let him tell you if he was ready to go back in. And I think that people are sometimes worried that they're interrupting in the dog's learning, and that's a viable concern, because I think that there are moments that people intervene when really it's the dog was going through a process, and if you just stuck with the process, probably would have a reasonable outcome, right? But when it comes to fear, and when it comes to the cases of flooding a dog and that possibility for that negative outcome, it's so much better just to put a pause on the opportunity, take the dog out, let him get water or whatever out in the parking lot, and let him see if he's trying to go back in or not.
So a lot of the time, the dog is going to tell you that. When dogs are having a good time at the dog park and the owners need to go, calling them in to get them on leash can be difficult.
Right.
If you call them in, or they're hanging out with you, and they're just kind of saying, "Put my leash on, let's go." These are telling behaviors, and you see you see those behaviors.
Yeah.
Like I'm ready to go now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, dogs are probably, well, there's no question, they're more perceptive in some senses than we are. So, if, even though your dog might be usually happy in a dog park, if all of a sudden you're down there and your dog looks like, he's a bit off, or, she's not liking what's going on, pay attention to that and trust her or him, and then maybe, like you say, take a break. I think that's great advice, to, really try to respond to how the dog seems to be doing in that setting, right? And I guess the other thing too, just to mention, I mean, we don't like to think of this, but you might be the owner of a dog that starts becoming like a bit of a bully to other dogs as well, right? So it's not only about trying to monitor your own dog's experience, it's monitoring how your dog is affecting other dogs' experiences as well. So if your dog for some reason starts being a little bit pushy, or showing behaviors that other dogs seem to be not engaging with or avoiding, that might also be information that your dog needs a break from that. And sometimes, maybe, who knows, I mean, again, this is sort of speculative because we don't have data, but it might be those individual dogs that are present that day, right? It could be, who knows. There's not been, one of the other things we would like to do, which we have not done, and I don't think anyone else has done it, is to actually look at sort of the longitudinal over time experience of dogs in the dog park and what that looks like, right? And there are no studies on that as far as I know.
I keep wanting to say, working the dog park, come on.
Yeah, I know. And I know we have heard from some owners sort of anecdotally that, oh yeah, I used to go to the dog park. I used to go down every, whatever day for 2 years, and then it changed, something changed. And they can often not point to what changed, whether it was about their own dog or whether it's about other dogs, or who knows, right? But yeah, that happens. And I think people need to be okay with that, right? That there's no badge of merit that you're going to get because you're, being a good dog owner by taking your dog to the dog park. You got to do what's good for your dog, whether it's what someone is telling you should be doing, or not. So, yeah.
Well, with all of that said, is there anything that I maybe haven't brought up or emphasized enough that you guys would like to discuss or maybe inform the common dog owner of? Is there anything that I've been remiss with?
The only thing I might like to say, I go soon, but is that everything that we have said in the last 10, 15 minutes has, of course, focused on the visual world, which is such a small part of the dog's world. We do not have that olfactometer, which I wish we had. But however, we can be sensitive to where dogs are putting their noses, what they're doing, is they're picking up lots of information and reacting to that. And the best we can do is occasionally be aware of the fact that they're using information we don't have a clue about.
Yeah. So I guess the only last thing that I'd say is that, there really are some excellent resources out there now, which is some really good books that are being written by people who think a lot about how to translate science into dog practical advice, I guess, for dog ownership or dog owners and dog welfare. And but there's also a lot of not so good advice out there, right? So it's a mixed bag.
It's like the internet.
Yeah, it is on the internet,
take it
right? Yeah.
Carefully.
So I think people, I would guess, I would want owners to, if you're really interested in, understanding dog behavior, track down some of the really good resources that are out there. People like Alexandra Horowitz, who's a researcher, Zessie Todd, who writes a companion animal psychology blog, and she's just come out with a book. There's all kinds of, I'm not thinking all of them off the top of my head, but there's really good resources out there. And I think, that if you want to, my bias, because I do research, right, is that anything that you do or you want to implement for training or whatever, really, you got to look to see, really, is this really being supported by the science that we have? And now there's science that we don't have, right? So unfortunately, like, we're still not there. We don't have like all the answers yet, but you do want to, be kind of like as selective as you can be, right? And don't take anyone at their word, including researchers.
Yes.
Think about what people are saying and where are they getting their information, and does that make sense? Like, is this something that people are just, oh, based on my experience, I can tell you, and there's a lot of that still out there. And I think, that's kind of, we're moving past that, I believe, in terms of
We hope.
canine science and training. But you want to be really critical thinker and really find the good information that's out there. And I think watching videos like yours, like your YouTube channel, is really something that can help people figure out, okay, what is the good stuff and what is maybe the not so good stuff. So I think what you're doing is fantastic, and we're really thankful, really grateful that you gave the opportunity to us to talk about our research, because, like, I don't know if you could tell, but we love talking about dogs. And we love talking about some of the work that we've been doing. So it's a great opportunity. Thank you.
I'm honestly so ecstatic that you guys were willing to speak with me. Like, I can't even put into words. Like, when I got that email, I was just like, oh my God, right? Because for a couple of reasons. One, because I just don't think that it was sort of like an imposter syndrome for a moment, where I was just like, am I really qualified to be talking to these people? Right? But then on the other hand, it's just like, I think because there's this disconnect, that part of our opinions is just sort of like we're in two different leagues, and so that we can't really necessarily cohabitate, right? And this is absolutely false. And I'm so blessed that there are other people that are with me in this journey to show that we can cohabitate. We can take this link between, a higher level learning and simplify it so that it's applicable for everyone.
Practical.
And so I'm so blessed and so grateful that you guys have decided to come on. I really appreciate it. Absolutely, I think if you're an audience and you're looking for the resources, I always apply some in the links in the description box below, and continue to check out all of my pages. And every single description box, I give usually a resource that I had not mentioned before. So some of them are repetitive, but usually there's always some sort of new resource. Because those resources are applicable. And one of my missions, and I know I'm small right now, but one of my goals is to show that what I'm doing is possible, so that other people, many, many other people, do similar things. Because I think that the more we show that this is a thing that can happen, where we can create this connection, and we can stand up and say that there doesn't need to be a disconnect between higher level learning and the common dog owner, then really dog owners will start demanding that they get access to that, right? They're going to say, wait, I didn't know that this was a possibility, and now that I do, I'm only going to go to these viable sources, right? So I really appreciate it. I know I overstayed my welcome. I really appreciate you guys spending so long with me, and I can't put in words enough how excited I am. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Yes, it was our pleasure. Yeah, we can talk for hours too, so it's okay.
Alrighty, guys. I will talk to you soon. I'll email you, and we'll chit chat. Okay?
Absolutely. Take care.
Okay, I'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.